We're here at Lexington and Concord, here where the very first shot heard around the world echoed out through history. This bridge is the very one where the soldiers marched across with the Americans on one side and the British over here, and they made history that day and set it in an action and course of independence that could not be turned back.
So we're going to talk today about lawful and unlawful resistance. One of the greatest examples of lawful resistance was demonstrated by Patrick Henry in a courthouse in Virginia. By Virginia law, the Act of 1748, Anglican ministers were paid a fixed salary of 16,000 pounds of tobacco per year. Due to a severe drought and a ruined tobacco harvest, the colonists were unable to pay the salary of the clergy. So the Virginians passed a law and a measure to allow paper currency to satisfy the payments of debts throughout the colony. Now, instead of suffering alongside their congregants, the Anglican ministers sued for their full pay. And the king vetoed and annulled the colonial law, and the clergy sued for their back pay. Enter 27-year-old Patrick Henry. He understood he was engaged in a opposition to the clergy, and he began his argument with timidity and awkwardness. Yet in stride, he quickly gained the sense of the cause for justice, and he began a profound display of oratorical brilliance. Henry argued that under the English Constitution, only a representative assembly has the power to levy taxes on the people that they represent. The king's veto was therefore null and void. Now the opposing counsel shouted, "The gentleman has spoken treason." The judge dismissed the charges, and Henry presented forward. He said, quote, "We have heard a great deal about the benevolence and holy zeal of our revered clergy. But how is this manifested? Do they manifest their zeal in the cause of religion and humility by practicing the mild and benevolent precepts of the gospel of Jesus? Do they feel the hungry and clothe the naked? Oh no, gentlemen. Instead of feeding the hungry and clothing the naked, these rapacious harpies would, were their powers equal to their will, snatch from the hearth the honest parishioners his last hoe cake, from the widow her orphan children, their last milk cow, the last bed, nay, the last blanket from the laying-in woman." End quote. The conclusion of the cause was an excellent example of jury nullification, for the judge had already ruled that the taxes must be paid, but the jury concluded that the payment was not to exceed 1 farthing, or 1 penny. This is just one of the many sparks of liberty that produced a spirit of lawful resistance in the American colonies.
All right, so we also need to talk about unlawful resistance. In every important movement, there are well done responses and less well done. So we just want to talk about some aspects of that. So by the late 1760s, this is right after the story that Kevin just told, the colonists are becoming exasperated. So they've been largely tolerant of the economic insults imposed on them by the king, but their situation is becoming less and less tolerable. I love this quote from John Adams. He says, he's commenting on the passive attempts to avoid buying or using taxed products. And here's his quote. He says, "Where will it carry us? If a duty was laid upon our horses, we may walk. If upon our butcher's meat, we may live upon the produce of the dairy. And if that should be taxed, we may subsist as well as our fellow slaves in Ireland upon Spanish potatoes and cold water. If 1,000 pounds was laid upon the birth of every child, if children are not begotten, none will be born. If upon every marriage, no duties will be paid if all the young gentlemen and ladies agree to live bachelors and maidens." He's, of course, being satirical. He's making a point that there is a limit to a person's ability to live lawfully when the laws become impossibly cumbersome. So the people are losing patience with the constant sabotage of their liberty. If they get married outside of the taxed Anglican church experience, their children may be regarded as illegitimate and they wouldn't inherit the land, which is a really big deal. Whenever they would set up a business that promised any kind of long-term profit, England would tax the ingredients just high enough to make American products too expensive to make, and they'd have to close up shop. When merchants sent their shiploads of tobacco back to England, they included a list of items to purchase as trade, and the London merchants would send them their list but claim their tobacco was suddenly worth less, and they'd suddenly the colonial farmer is in debt. And this is not only insulting, it was in many cases disastrous. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow, but I just wanted to lay a groundwork for why the resistance was what it was, what the motives were. Okay, so Patrick Henry's lawful legal resistance in the courts in 1763 was the herald of the end of tolerance across all the colonies. Now, if you read anything from the National Parks Association, which we've been in lots of national parks, and you can read these online too, or the historical societies, you'll see a narrative that basically claims there was widespread mob violence incited by the Sons of Liberty, and they particularly go after Sam Adams. He's their primary target, but they include all the leaders as well as completely responsible. And this is a huge oversimplification. Mob activity among working classes increased because the Crown shut down the local courts, so the people had no means to resolve their grievances or preserve law and order. Notably, the New England protesters never killed anyone, so that's something to think about. Whenever you have any kind of protest, there's often destruction and death, and the New Englanders never killed anyone. A few times they were killed in the Boston Massacre and a few other individual times. They did destroy the property of 4 specific individuals' property to send a specific message. 3 houses and a carriage.
Carriage cracks me up.
I'm smiling, but of course we know that that is not an appropriate way to address a grievance. They never went through city centers, though, causing widespread destruction. It's important to note that destruction of private property, like I said, is not a proper way to address a grievance. But just a huge contrast between this and other similar revolutions. The historical revisionists, though, who hate America's Christian heritage, have led a campaign to rewrite the story and make this sound like any standard revolution, when this is not the case. Sam Adams repeatedly condemned mob violence. You can find all his movements and articles where he was telling people he was doing his best to limit actions to strategic economic initiatives. He wasn't always successful, and he gets blamed for that, which is not fair, because he was specifically telling people not to participate in that. So the actual historic record, not what you will find from the historical societies, proves that he and other leaders of the Sons of Liberty repeatedly did not support illegal mob acts or people who crossed the line into violence. Just one more quick note on that. Tarring and feathering, we need to address tarring and feathering really briefly. Definitely not something we condone. It was illegal, and in 2 cases it was really terrible and barbaric. But there are some major discrepancies in modern accounts. Again, the Modern Historical Society will tell you that the colonists tarred and feathered 70 individuals in terrible barbaric ways, and that is simply not the case. This is not just the Modern Historical Societies. This has spread across media and literature, so I think it's really important that you actually know what happened. So tarring and feathering was a maritime tradition using warm, not scalding hot pine tar, not asphalt. Tar was often smudged over a person's clothes, and a few feathers were thrown on. It was meant to be embarrassing since pine tar was difficult to wash off, but it was not supposed to be physically harmful. They were not tarring merchants or persons with authority. They were going after smuggling informants. So these were people who were working for the crown, and they stood to gain a third of the profit when they accused a merchant of smuggling. So Britain was enabling this shameful behavior because they liked the idea, of course, of charging fees to colonial merchants in any way, shape, or form. So tarring was a public way of warning against participating in Britain's unethical informant operation. But then in 1774, things got way out of hand in one specific case, the case of John Malcolm. So he actually struck a boy and his father on the head with a club when they called him out for informing on colonial merchants. And the crowds at the dock lost their minds. The tar was too hot. It burned him really badly. He was struck repeatedly with poles and clubs. The humiliation went overboard. And believe it or not, there was a chairman of the Committee for Tarring and Feathering, Jules Jr., and he called it out and condemned. He repudiated the attack. He said that was not the way we tar and feather. So there were no more instances of tarring and feathering after that one. We can hope the New Englanders had a stroke of conscience and realized that they had gone way too far. But it's important to note again that unlike most historical cases of mob violence, American colonists never killed anyone and caused very little damage to personal or public property. And Kurtis, of course, you'll be thinking about the Tea Party when I say that, and Kurtis will cover that tomorrow. We're going to actually go to the Tea Party Museum and dig into some of the Tea Party history, and then we'll report back to you on there. Before we leave off unlawful riots, I just want one more little story to throw in here. John Adams, a fantastic character. In response to the Boston Massacre, so in Boston Massacre, a mob of colonial miscreants attacks a British soldier with clubs and ice, and other British soldiers ended up firing into the mob, and they killed 5 colonists. And the majority of Boston's population wanted the soldiers tried and hanged for their decision to fire into an unfirearmed crowd. And nobody would consent to give them any legal defense, but John Adams agreed, at tremendous risk to his reputation and livelihood. He began his defense with these famous words: "If by supporting the rights of mankind and of invincible truth, I shall contribute to save from the agonies of death one unfortunate victim of tyranny or of ignorance equally fatal, his blessings and tears of transport will be sufficient consolation to me for the contempt of all mankind." End of quote. He also said, "Facts are stubborn things." He had so many amazing, really good quotes in his defense, and he succeeded in convincing the jury to acquit most of the British soldiers. And because of this, mob violence almost disappeared. Now that we know that if we incite British soldiers to shoot us, and they do, and it's innocent, they will be acquitted. Now we're not going to go inciting soldiers to shoot us. So it was replaced by legal resistance through the organized actions of elected local militia. And what's really fun, Kevin's going to help us out with that topic, and right behind us, you probably can't see it, but just beyond the bridge is the Minuteman
Monument.
The Minuteman Monument.
So modern textbooks and popular media often portray the Minutemen as an undisciplined band of angry farmers, shopkeepers, and hot-headed peasants who suddenly grabbed their muskets in a feverish, emotional panic to cause an uprising against the king. The colonial militia were not that. They were well-ordered, self-disciplined, and legally established institutions. Under the law of the colonial charters, the militia was the official defense force for the local government, designed specifically to maintain peace, safety, and public order. Militia units regularly mandated training days where men were drilled in military tactics, formations, and military proficiency under elected officers. The Minutemen were the elite, highly vetted detachments chosen from these regular militias because they were the most disciplined, well-trained, and capable to be deployed at a moment's notice. For over a decade, from 1765 to 1775, the colonists exhausted every possible peaceful, legal, and political avenue, including petitions, declarations of grievances, and economic boycotts before ever firing a shot. Now, according to the Reformed political theology, which was rooted in Calvin's Institutes and the Vindice contra tyrannis and Lex Rex, defensive violence is only legitimate when it meets strict scriptural criteria. It must be led by lawful authority. God's law requires that resistance be led by the higher powers or civil magistrates of the local community, such as the colonial assemblies, judges, and militia captains. These officials are ordained by God to protect the innocent, per Romans 13. And they must also be functioning in a defense of covenant. When a supreme ruler violates his oath, breaks the Constitution, and uses military force to crush the citizens, the lower magistrate becomes the lawful means against an unlawful aggressor. At that point, the lesser magistrate has an obligation to interpose, using defensive force to uphold the law and protect the people under their care. When the Minutemen stood on the green at Lexington and at the bridge here in Concord, they were acting under the explicit command of their locally elected captains and town officials. They were the lower level of law enforcement, physically executing a covenantal check against an invading military force. Lawless rebellion and chaotic rioting are inherently anti-God and acts of decreation. They tear down the righteous social order and replace it with anarchy, where might makes right. The American founders and the colonial pastors, they utterly rejected this lawless mechanism. They did not launch a free man-style revolution designed to burn society to the ground. They engaged in proper covenantal resistance to keep the British crown from plundering their establishments and destroying their covenantal society or turning it into a lawless tyranny.
Yeah, and so then that brings us to the next part of the story, which is Paul Revere's ride. Well, actually, that comes slightly before because he had to warn them. But we've talked about the Parsons Cause and the duty of interposition, like Kevin was talking about. And we've discussed the ways in which tyranny is to be responded to. And we heard stories in which some men succeeded in this end in ways in which they acted poorly. And now we come to the first armed conflict in the cause of independence, when the colonial men take up arms to defend their munitions against the occupying military force. And we're talking about here Lexington and Concord. But before we discuss the shot heard around the world, we need to look at the events that led up to it and what did it look like for a family on the ground in Boston in 1775. After the Boston Tea Party in 1773 and the results of the colony to the refusal of them to pay back the money for that tea, the governor of Massachusetts was recalled to England, and King George appointed General Gage in his place. With Gage came martial law and a military dictatorship. He revoked the Massachusetts charter, he abolished local laws, and banned town meetings. The colonists, of course, viewed this as a complete and total violation of their sovereignty under the king and an attack on their self-government. Gage shut down the Massachusetts General Court, but the colonists refused to submit to this illegal act and instead formed the Provincial Congress. To counter Gage's tyranny, the Sons of Liberty, which Aubrey mentioned, set up secret headquarters in the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston. From here, they could monitor General Gage's activities, share intelligence, and make plans. Then in April 1775, the British determined to seize the gunpowder and munitions hidden in Lexington and Concord. Paul Revere learns of this plot and takes his famous ride to warn the local militias. So then, riding at that night, he cries, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" The Minutemen responded to defend their families and property against the approaching army, taking a stand on the bridge here at Concord. These were disciplined men, men of duty, responsibility, and a love of liberty. And they viewed their actions as a necessary defense against the illegal actions of a tyrant. The colonists were successful in routing the British troops and sending them back to Boston. The American founders, they viewed the use of force as the king abdicating government, and by declaring themselves out of his protection and waging war against them. It was the point at which there was no turning back for the colonists.
So we have made the case up to this point that the foundations for all of the actions of the colonists were built on Christian principles, and we keep coming back to that. We like to harp on it. And in that context, the words of the Declaration of Independence, which is more or less a high point in all of this conflict, none of these words should surprise us. One of the common complaints of many Christians in our generation is that the language isn't nearly Christian enough, and it's hard for us to recognize some of the concepts in language because we are removed from them. So this stems in large part from a misunderstanding of terms. Ideologies shift and language shifts with them. So there are some things where the definitions have changed, or we're not familiar with concepts or the words that they use to describe them. There are as well, we have noted, Enlightenment bugs in the verbiage, but the prevailing framework for this declaration was that it was an open letter to the King of England as a statement of broken covenant and an annulment of obligations. So as Kurtis said, there was a point of no return that they reached with the king. He had broken covenant, and this was their statement of that information back to him, telling him they're laying down the law to the king. So these aren't wild-eyed revolutionaries howling for blood. These are God-fearing men sticking their necks out and calling out the most powerful monarch on earth at the time and insisting he bend before a higher authority. So this appeal to lawful framework already in place to justify their separation from English oppression is remarkably well composed in light of that context. Simply and clearly it identifies the broken bonds. And as some have noted, this Declaration of Independence bears all the markers of a writ of divorce. Now, if this comparison seems strange to some, it is because we are woefully unfamiliar with God's law and what his statutes and case laws have to say about human covenants and how they are to be kept and what constitutes a broken covenant. The principles for separation of parties found in the Mosaic Code set the stage for this separation of parties. The founders did not consider their declaration an invention or an innovation. It was a lawful usage of God's order to arbitrate in a human matter. They considered the Declaration a measured, long-awaited, and reasoned response to broken promise after broken promise by King George III. So as conflict fomented, the Christian nature of the American movement was so well understood, even the king and his loyalists rightly called this the Presbyterian Rebellion because they understood that the ideas in the Declaration and later the Constitution were fundamentally Christian ideas from a particular Christian persuasion. Presbyterianism kind of at that time encompassed that as well as Congregationalism. So this constituted the covenantal framework that the founders were working off of when they wrote this declaration. Again, if we remember who is writing this story, that is God, we recognize this providential character of the Declaration. Human emotion and reason would have turned uglier and deadlier much sooner, as Aubrey described, and we have seen that in our current generation and all throughout history. Ultimately, it would have failed, and we've seen many times where regimes that were not built on these principles of lawful resistance to tyranny completely flounder and end in complete death. Historians do agree that by human calculation, the founders should have failed. They didn't have the superior forces, the money, or power. Awakening took place by divine power, and God's little troop of Christians overthrew the iron fist of the greatest empire on earth at the time. So we give thanks to him for the nature of the resistance that the colonists offered, and inasmuch as they offered it rightly. We watch for the failures and note them where they need to be noted, but overall we would say this was a very successful lawful resistance to unlawful tyranny.